Good morning. This is Ria Luz, and I just wanted to share with you the continuation of the book, Mother of Peace. This is an amazing book of the memoir of Dr. Hak Jahan Moon, and and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. An amazing story of a woman's determination and her faith and love for God. And we have finished yesterday on page 64. So I'm going to continue reading on page 65, The Marriage Supper of the Lamb. Hope you can join me. And if you have time, just drop your link as I also would have some video playing while I am reading with you this book. Chapter 3, The Marriage Supper of the Lamb. The true meaning of sacrifice. My mother officially joined the Unification Church in Seoul on December 15, 1955. Early in the following year, a small yet historic step was made as the Chuncheon Unification Church convened its first public Sunday service at a home in Yoksa-dong. I was a young girl of 13 who had just graduated from Bongwi Elementary School. One day, when the sun was shining brightly, my mother said to me, "Let's go to Seoul for the day." Without knowing why we were going, I followed her. That was the day I first met Father Moon. Chongpadong Church, where we first met, was a small, two-story wooden house. The Korean government had categorized it as enemy property because it had been owned by the Japanese during their occupation of our country. It was more like a it was more like a home than a church. I greeted Father Moon politely, and as he returned the greeting, he asked my mother, "Who is this child?" "This is my daughter," she replied. With a look of surprise, Father Moon gazed at me as he said to my mother, "You had such a pretty daughter." He then closed his eyes, as if in meditation, and asked my name. I politely replied, "My name is Hak Jahan." As if struck by something, Father Moon spoke very softly to himself. "Hak Jahan has been born in Korea. Hak Jahan has been born in Korea. Hak Jahan has been born in Korea." After saying this 3 times, he began expressing gratitude to God, saying, "You sent such a magnificent daughter named Hak Jahan to Korea. Thank you." Then Father Moon spoke to me as if he were asking me to gather my resolve. "Hak Jahan, you will make many sacrifices in the future." "Yes," I replied, surprised at my own forwardness. On the way home, on the train, my mother and I thought the encounter was curious. "How strange," she said. "Why would he repeat that you were born in Korea 3 times?" As we fell into silence, I contemplated the word sacrifice. The word Father Moon used took on a meaning different from what I had learned in textbooks. What he was alluding to was a higher dimension of sacrifice, a nobler and more complete sacrifice. What you sacrifice is important, but why you make the sacrifice is even more important. As I listened to the rhythmic rumble of the train and looked out the window at the scenery as it slipped by, I couldn't stop thinking about why Father Moon had said. I thought about what I might need to sacrifice for one day, The word sacrifice was engraved in my heart. Thinking back as the person called to live as the mother of peace, I realized that over time, sacrifice became a name I could call myself. God is my Father. Thank you for coming. Because Sweet Apple TV, Rose Cooking, Plug, Sweet Apple, Vigilan. Yes, thank you. God is my Father on page 67. From the time I could understand words, my maternal mother, Jo Wonmo, consistently taught me one thing. God is your father. She went so far to say, your mother is like your nanny who is raising you as God's daughter. Since I had been surrounded by an atmosphere of faith, even while in my mother's womb, I accepted it. I accepted this without a second thought. When I heard the word God, my heart would open unreservedly and fill with warmth. My mother did not mind investing herself, body and soul, for the purpose of raising me to reject secular life and follow God's way. She lived with single-minded devotion in absolute unity with the obedience to God. After joining the Unification Church, our family moved to Seoul, where she worked even harder to protect me from the world's temptation. As a result of her dedication, God allowed me to see myself as a noble crane. Even as an adolescent in middle school, I poured my heart into quiet reading and study. I attended the Songjong Girls Middle School located in Sajik-dong of Seoul's Jongno district, situated at the southern foot of Mount Inwang. It was a small school that seemed always bathed in sunlight. From the moment of its founding, that school shared in the suffering of the Korean people. It was established in May 1950, but had to close less than a month later due to the Korean War. After the war, its doors reopened, and true to its mission, the school prepared many girls to attend talented women who would help build a prosperous country. In 1981, the school moved to the Eunpyeong district of Seoul, and in 1984, its name was changed to Sangjin's Girls' Middle School. Our Tongil group acquired the school in 1987 and brought it into the Sunhak Academy family. I had continued to give it support and attention. In middle school, I spoke little and developed a calm personality. I studied hard. I studied hard and always ranked at the top of my class. I was pretty and modest, and I was always quiet and well behaved. I received love and attention from my teachers. My school life was uneventful. I only remember that I missed a day or two of school in the first year when I became quite sick. In my second and third years, I received an award from earning the highest grades in my class. I preferred to read in a quiet spot and listen to music rather than engage in social life or sports. My hobby was drawing. I enjoyed art, and I had some talent, but set aside the possibility of becoming a professional artist. For all 3 years of middle school, I was the class representative on the student council, and in the third year, I was the head of the student activities committee. I led many student activities, and this awakened my leadership abilities. One day, when the entire school was gathered, I went to the podium and I announced the decision of the student council. The teachers complimented me on my poise and confident attitude. After witnessing this side of me, this, which they had not seen before, the teachers commented, Hakja seems gifted. I thought she was just quiet and docile, but actually, she shows good leadership skills. During adolescence, I didn't worry about my life or losing my way. I credit this to my grandmother and mother instilling in me a deep faith in God and the habit of living in attendance to Him. My mother, in particular, strictly guided my life of faith. Yes, there were times when I thought it's difficult and worrisome, but I am grateful now, for it prepared me to blossom as the only begotten daughter of God, who one day would meet the only begotten Son of God. Within that atmosphere, I grew roots of unshakable faith. I read a lot. I enjoyed reading tales of the saints and particularly The Good Earth by Pearl S. Buck. The characters in that book struggle against nature and fate. The story helped me realize that ultimately we must return to nature's embrace, represented in that book by the earth. It is human nature to cling to God's embrace. I earnestly wish to be together with God, and for that reason I devoured songs and novels with the love of one's hometown. I knew from a young age that God is my Father, and naturally connected everything I read to God. I cut off entirely from the harsh secular world and lived a chaste life as if I were a nun. I was aware that a higher power was guiding me, that my path had been prepared in heaven. Especially during this time, the Bible was my close companion. I cried myself to sleep many nights after reading about God's history of creation, the tragic fall, and God's work of salvation carried out through historical figures who took responsibility at the behest of heaven. I learned how they sacrificed themselves and realized that God created us so He could love us as His children. After reading God's bitter history and His desire to embrace us, even though we gave Him only pain and sadness. It was not just once or twice that I lay awake, unable to sleep, my heart aching for Him. I naturally continued to ponder even more deeply what Teacher Moon had said to me about sacrifice. That question, what can I sacrifice for God, was shaping my life. Without sacrifice and service, one cannot even begin to think one is living for the sake of others rather than for oneself. As I strictly cultivated my faith from a young age, I cherished a dream deep within my heart. That dream was to liberate my Heavenly Father, who throughout history gave Himself for the salvation of humanity. I wish to free Him from the chains of our fallen history. We cannot meet God from a position of reigning over others. He finds us when we are silently working for the sake of those in greater difficulty than ourselves. I came to know that when we think about God's will from the lower position, the position of offering and self sacrifice, God's bitterness washes away and He will come to us. During the post-war years, the streets of Seoul were full of the wounded. Numerous children, including war orphans, were suffering from hunger and disease. Few people were able to get timely treatment when they became sick. I wanted to heal people's injuries, relieve their pain, and guide them to a brighter world. Was it as it was time for me to enter high school in the spring of 1951, I entered St. Joseph's Nursing School. Page 671, Heavenly and Earthly Phoenixes. In the late 1950s, it wasn't easy for a single mother. My mother managed to make ends meet by doing any odd job that came to her. She did not rest even a moment in her devoted life of faith, and in that way she triumphed over those hardship and tribulation. One day, however, she announced to her small family, I've been living meaninglessly. I must live a life of greater value. She left my maternal grandmother and me in the care of my aunt and moved into the Chongpadong church and dedicated herself completely to church activities. She chose to take on the most menial of tasks. People would try to dissuade her, but she pursued such work with a joyful and grateful heart. She had lived a life of devoted faith in North Korea greater than anyone, but started at the bottom in the Unification Church. She overworked herself, however, and her body grew weaker and weaker until she became seriously ill. Luckily, a church member she knew from the Inside the Womb church took her in. This person, Mrs. Oh Yon Chon, was like a sister to her. They lived together in the Noryangjin neighborhood, and as they cared for each other, my mother gradually recovered her health. While at nursing school, I attended Chungpadong Church every Sunday. One day, when my mother saw me there, she took me to a corner and softly whispered, "A few nights ago, I had a dream that was hard to understand." "What did you dream?" I asked. "There were women from church wearing holy robes and standing there holding pink flowers," she said. "And I saw you walking toward Teacher Moon." At the time, we called we called Father Moon Teacher. All of a sudden, thunder roared and lightning crashed from the sky and struck one spot. There you were, and other women all look at you enviously. She paused, collecting her thoughts. "That's when I woke up. I think it means something will happen that will shake the world." "I think so too," I replied. "I'm sure it is a prophetic dream, but I don't want to guess more than that." My mother did not imagine that this dream was a revelation from God, a prophecy that her only daughter would be called to become the true mother, who would give her life to the world. But I had been thinking constantly of the word sacrifice and had determined to live a life of sacrifice to God. This dream fit with that, and I had a sense of its meaning. In the late autumn of 1950, Father Moon, in the late autumn of 1959, Father Moon conducted a national missionary workshop at the Chongpadong Church, and I participated with my mother. I was on one side of the overcrowded church, busy with the workshop, but could see on the other side elder sisters were quietly working on other important matters. A few months earlier, senior grandmothers of deep faith had begun preparation for Father Moon's marriage. They were considering which among the women of the church would be God's choice to be his bride. As I was only a schoolgirl and so much younger than Father Moon, my name would not have come up. Then one day, one of the sages among the grandmothers sought out Father Moon to tell him about her dream. "I saw many flocks of cranes flying down from heavens," she told him, "and even though I kept trying to shoo them away, they came and covered Teacher Moon." Father Moon provided no interpretation, so the elder sister continued with confidence. "I believe my dream is revealing God's will, that your bride's name will include a Chinese character for hak, meaning crane." Shortly after I heard that, my mother told me another revelation she had prepared in prayer. A phoenix flew down from heaven. Another flew from the earth to meet it. The phoenix from heaven was Father Moon. It brought to her mind her dream years before, when she went to Daegu to meet Father Moon, dream in which a pair of golden dragons bowed down in the direction of Seoul. My mother thought about what all this might mean, and then one morning at dawn she received a heavenly message. She had just taken a cold shower, and it came as she was reciting the pledge prayer. The phoenix descending from heaven represents True Father, she announced, and the phoenix rising from the earth represents True Mother. My mother was happy with this understanding, but she continued quietly with the workshop and didn't speak about it. In the months following my 16th birthday, I matured quickly, and it caught people's attention at church. Member would mention that I look elegant and neat. I would hear someone say, Hakja is a peaceful and virtuous. She is like a crane, befitting her name. And another, she is also very polite, and if you watch, you will see. She is very observant and has clear judgment. I took out I took out when I was with members of the congregation. I stood out when I was with members of the congregation. People commented that I had anointed purity, that I was one with God's will, and that I had embraced the virtue of obedience through the difficulties I had endured in North Korea. Hearing such comments, I had disciplined myself not to feel proud or act carelessly. More than anything else, for his bride to be, Father Moon was looking for a person with a sacrificial and devoted heart of living for others. He did not care about family background, economic status, or appearance. She had to be a woman with absolute faith who would love the world. She had to be a woman who could conceive for saving the world. Because he has been unable to find such a woman, there had been no marriage with the Lamb. He still did not fully know that the heavenly bride, who would become the mother of heaven, earth, and humankind, was close by. I had to come to understand God's will, but was not going to say anything. To recognize the bride was Father Moon's mission and responsibility. The heavenly bride. A short time later, Mrs. Oh Yong-chun, a devout member who had taken in my mother, went to her job in a clothing store in the second floor of the Nakpong building in Central Seoul. She assisted the store owner at making garments. The owner was a longtime member we called the prayer mother, grandmother. When Mrs. O arrived, the owner was sewing together a man's suit. Mrs. O sat next to her as she pumped the wheel of the sewing machine and asked casually, "Oh, who is the suit for?" "This suit is for Father Moon," that was the grandmother's answer. "He's is going to wear it at his engagement ceremony." Mrs. O perked up immediately, and her eyes widened as she asked the natural question, "Who is the bride?" "Well," replied the grandmother, nonchalantly, "the day of the engagement has been decided, but the bride hasn't been chosen yet. However, the ceremony is going to be held soon, and so I am making his suit." Mrs. O's mind was buzzing. Who is going to be the bride? She pondered the question, but couldn't come up with any possibilities. Mrs. O was a person who often heard God's voice in revelation. In fact, she had been offering prayerful devotion for 7 years for the sake of the appearance of the true mother. She right away took her question to God in prayer, and she received a revelation. Because Eve fell when she was 16 years old, the heavenly bride needs to be younger than 20. This had never occurred to her before. It was only then that she understood the logic of God's will. She asked God again and again, "Who is the heavenly bride who is younger than 20?" And before long, she thought of me. "I know Hakja, who is around 16." She said to herself. "She often sits right next to me in church. Why didn't I think of her? Would it really be her?" At 10 o'clock that evening, Mrs. O was making her way after finishing her work. She was on the Noryangjin bus, as it was crossing the Han River, when God spoke to her. "It will be Hakja! It will be Hakja!" God's revelation descended upon Mrs. O like a wave of energy in the autumn night sky. She arrived in her neighborhood around 10:11 p.m. But instead of going home, she hurried to see my mother, who lived near her. "Sune, Are you sleeping? Not yet. Come in. How old is your daughter? My mother gave her a puzzled look. Mrs. O had skipped all formalities and asked a point-blank question. Why are you visiting me in the middle of the night to ask me how old my daughter is? Don't change the subject. Please tell me. She's 16, turning 17 next year. What's, when is her birthday? She was born in 1943 on the sixth day of the first lunar month. She was the same birthday as our master. Why are you suddenly asking me such question? Mrs. O and my mother were old friends. They were the same age, and they had attended the same school in their hometown in North Korea. In addition, their mothers were very close friends. My mother, in fact, was living in Noryangjin, across the street from Mrs. O. Mrs. O had found this place for my mother when she had fallen into poor health while doing her church work. Just as abruptly as she had arrived, Mrs. O bid my mother good night and departed, leaving my mother to figure out what was on her mind. The next day, as soon as it became light, Mrs. O was on her way back to work at the Nakwang building. God's revelation about me completely distracted her, and the workday came and went without her realizing what she was doing. When she finished her work, she went directly to see a fortune teller. To this day, Koreans often consult fortune tellers for guidance about marriage. And that's what Mrs. O did. She described to the fortune teller the two persons about whom she was consulting. Without mentioning their names, right away the fortune teller's eyes widened. There was a large gap between the age of these two persons. But it doesn't matter. They are a match made in heaven. I have rarely made such a couple. I have rarely seen such a couple whose fortunes are so aligned. Mrs. O felt her heart was about to explode. She calmed herself and went directly to church to meet our teacher and tell him everything. As soon as she gained a private space with him, she blurted out, Hakjahan, the daughter of Hong Song-e, is the heavenly bride. She waited for a response, but Father Moon didn't say a word. He had listened to many members suggest who might be his bride, and none of them had paid much attention to me. I didn't worry about that. I kept my mind on heaven. I knew then, I knew now, that a person's destiny is not contingent upon external evidence. God is the judge, and is predestined, and that the only begotten Son will marry the only begotten daughter prepared by God, and that this is in the hands of God. I knew it was Father Moon's mission and duty to recognize the only begotten daughter. I may have been young in many years, but my heart toward God was unwavering. I waited for the time. One day, not long after that, hearing the sound of a magpie sitting on a branch of a tree outside the window of my dormitory room, I had a premonition that I was about to receive good news. I went to the window, opened it, looked up toward the sky, and I heard God's voice. Those were days in which God was giving me revelation, not only in my dreams, but also like waves coming down from the blue skies. I heard a word, the time is near. It was the voice of God. I had heard it often since I was a child. I had always felt that I would meet a very precious person one day, as if someone were pushing me. I closed my books and I left the dormitory. Something was telling me that my mother was not feeling well. As I was crossing the Han River in the bus, many thoughts flooded my mind. Does crossing the river mean that I'm crossing over to a different world from the one in which I had been living? How many stories have I embraced by the river? How many stories are embraced by the river, swirling beneath its confidently flowing surface? Is the heart of God who is searching for us like this river. I got off the bus and started walking up the Noryangjin Hill toward my house. As I climbed the slope, an unusually bright winter sun drew me onward in spite of the wind from the Han River blowing against my forehead. When my mother saw me, she did not seem at all unwell. She looked rather excited and gratified to see me arrive. My confusion as to what drew me home dissipated right away as she held the door open and quickly put on her coat. "I have received a message from the church," she told me. "We have to go there right now." To me, it was it was a given that the news that awaited us at the church, whatever it might be, had been prepared by God. The scene of my first meeting with Father Moon was just after that I had finished elementary school. Passed before me like a panoramic vision, I recalled the dream I had after that meeting. Father Moon appeared in it with a young and gentle face, and I clearly heard God's revelation: "Prepare, for the time is near." Recalling this strict command from heaven, walking toward the church, I surrendered myself completely, with a heart filled with trust in my Heavenly Father. "Until now, I have lived according to your will," I said to our Heavenly Parent in prayer. "Whatever be your will and providence, I am with it already." But because I knew God's sorrowful grip, a courage based on my faith in God rose up within me. I felt I would gratefully accept whatever might be asked of me. And I heard God's voice again. I felt the same presence that I felt in the upper room of the inside the womb church when Grandmother Ho anointed me, and when the monk passing by our house had prophesied about me. Bathed in that presence, I heard the words, "Mother of the universe, the time has come." It was like the sound of a gong reverberating in the air. The voice spoke again. "I am the Alpha and the Omega, and I have been waiting for the Mother of the universe since the creation of the world." When I heard those words, I knew what my future was to be, and it settled in my heart, and created an ocean of calm. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve talked with God directly and heard God's word with their own ears. I had such a direct conversation with God from a young age. I continued working, going to church, while holding my mother's hand as I had done so many times before. My mother and I arrived at the Chongpadong Church. It was February 26, 1960, a day when winter was withdrawing and spring was signaling its advent. Father Moon met with my mother and me all day in order to come to a conclusion about the heavenly bride. He and I talked about many things of nine over the course of 9 hours. At his request, I drew him a picture. I spoke clearly as I answered his question about my hopes and aspirations, remembering how Jacob, Jacob received God's blessing at Bethel. I happily yet curiously said to him, "I will bear many heavenly children." What God told Jacob at Bethel came into my mind. "And thy seed shall be the dust of the earth, and thou shalt spread abroad to the west and to the east, and to the north and to the south. And in thee and in thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed." I determined that I would embrace all the people of the world, all the people of the earth, and bring them new life as God's good children. When Isaac went up Mount Moriah with Abraham to offer a sacrifice, he asked his father where the offering was. Abraham answered that God had prepared a sacrifice and said nothing more. With that, Isaac, even at his young age, could understand the situation and realize that he was the sacrifice to be offered to heaven. Just as Isaac obediently lay upon the altar, I knew that God had prepared me as the heavenly bride, and that this was God's predestined providence. I had no question or doubt in my heart. I had only the desire to keep going on the path. I accepted God's command in a state of complete selflessness. On the way back home from this extraordinary day, my mother looked at me with warm eyes. You are usually so meek and calm. I didn't know you could be so bold. I reflected on the fact that the holy wedding is not based on how bold a person is. In order to multiply God's lineage, true mother had to bear many good children, and therefore she had to marry in her teens. Such a bride would be a patriot. Such a bride should be of patriotic family. I realize as well with the life of faith. I, I realize as well with the life of faith inherited over 3 generations. 3 years before that, a number of single women believers had put themselves forward as marriage candidates before Father Moon, several around the age of 30, as I had hopes, had high hopes as Father Moon himself was nearing 40. Even in that circumstance, and having publicly announced the date of the holy wedding, Father Moon had maintained silence. He was waiting on heaven to decide who would be his bride. He knew that God is the one to prepare the only begotten daughter. Only God can confirm the bride for whom the marriage supper of the Lamb is conducted. God alone knows who is to become the mother of the universe and the mother of peace. For the salvation of all humankind and the realization of a world of peace, I determined myself and declare before Father Moon that I would rise to the position of the true parent. I accepted Father Moon as the only begotten Son for the accomplishment of our Heavenly Parent's will. It was God's call to me to become the Heavenly Bride and the Mother of the universe. I knew that my path would be unimaginably difficult, yet I pledged I would live for God and absolutely fulfill my mission to save the world. I pledge before God and Father Moon, no matter how difficult the path may be, I will complete God's providence of restoration during my lifetime. And that, and then I pledge, and then I pledge one more time. I'll do whatever it takes to fulfill our Heavenly Parents' will. I have defined and lived with that commitment. I have lived, I have defined and lived my life with that commitment. The course of human events is open and predictable. Church members were so astonished when the news spread that Father Mood had chosen Hak Jahan, that 17-year-old nursing student. The course of human events is open and predictable. Church members were so astonished when the news spread that Father Moon had chosen Hak Jahan, that 17-year-old nursing student, to be his bride. Some people thought it was a false rumor. Some were taken aback. Some rejoiced. Some were jealous. I remember Father Moon's words from 4 years before. You will need to make sacrifices in the future. And I know that each day was going to be a learning experience concerning what that meant. When my grandmother's ancestors, when my mother's grandmother ancestor Yo Hanjun showed sincere loyalty and devotion to his country, He received the revelation, I will send your lineage the princess of God. In return for my ancestors' devotion, his sacrifice with no desire for recognition, God chose our family to exemplify the tradition of loyalty and filial piety. My mother was born to my grandmother, who had deep piety, and I was born to my mother. I traced God's will to send to the world his only begotten daughter, which was born fruit through me, back to my ancestor Johann Jun. To fulfill my mission as God's only begotten daughter, I have a firm belief and unflinching will for the sake of every nation, every religion, every race, going beyond all fallen world boundaries. I am called to reconcile nations and races with benevolence and love. I am called to be like the ocean that accepts and absorbs the water of all rivers, big and small alike, embodying our God, who is our Heavenly Mother as well as Heavenly Father. I am called to embrace all who are lost and have no one to receive them with the heart of a parent. I set these things in my flesh and blood, in my beating heart, and I have not for 1 second forgotten the will that God entrusted to me. 70 years late, 60 years have passed since our holy wedding, and my husband, now not with us physically, more than ever, no matter what my age or physical condition may be, my beating heart drives me forward on the path to become the mother of the universe and the mother of peace. One in mind, one in body, and one in heart, and in one harmony with the one who guides the providence. Thank you for joining, and I will finish here at page 81. Thank you for supporting me in this reading. Thank you so much for all of you for joining. And I will, if you enjoy this book, please join me again tomorrow or the next time I do my live streaming to continue reading this book. What an amazing woman this is Dr. Hak Jahan Moon, and her book is called Mother of Peace, and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. This is her story at the young age of 17, and there will be more to share with you as I can continue reading these wonderful books. This is her life story and a story of a liberation of all women, where we can understand once woman's determination and faith in the love for God to share all her life, the sacrifice for heaven. Thank you so much, Rose Cooking Blog, for joining, and I hope you can join me again next day as we continue reading this. I stopped at page 81, and the next story, the next chapter will be our holy wedding ceremony. Hope to see you in my next reading of this book. Thank you so much for joining, and God bless you. Thank you. See you soon.